George Groves wins by 5th round stoppage against Andrea de Luisa. The opponent is down 2 times in the 5th round, debatably down 1 time in the 4th round, and his corner threw in the towel. In many ways reminiscent of when they threw in the towel against Lucien Boutte. All in all, this was a decent comeback, if you want to use the word comeback, for George Groves. I thought the first 3 rounds he boxed quite smartly. It was quite a measured performance from him. He wasn't really putting the pedal to the metal. He wasn't taking too many risks. He was just staying to his boxing. He came out, he was getting quite low, a lot of upper body movement, a lot of head movement, a lot of angles, and he was fighting behind a jab. And as we know, George Groves has a very, very good jab. And to be honest, he wasn't finding it hard to hit De Luisa with the jab. As I thought may be the case, he was able to kind of cut through De Luisa's defences and hit him and bloody his nose and bust him up a bit with that jab. Groves really had the speed, he had the timing, he had the accuracy to put him a level above De Luisa in this fight. As for the opponent, he showed a bit of heart in there, didn't stay down, he managed to get up, but he looked very, very overmatched. And really, in the whole 5 rounds, there wasn't a single moment where he landed anything in terms of offence on George Groves, really. He struggled with Groves' movement, he struggled with Groves' whole sort of demeanour in the ring, and really struggled to find his range and land on Groves. For me, he looked a lot slower, a lot less powerful, and just outclassed against George Groves. Now, having said that, for me, in the first 3 rounds, George Groves, whilst he was boxing very sensibly and winning convincingly without too much trouble coming back his way, he perhaps didn't show the levels of his game that we saw, as we famously remember in the first Carl Froch's 1 round. It was a slightly more controlled, measured performance. He wasn't going for the knockout in a brutal fashion. He was more kind of picking his shots. Maybe it's an older, more mature George Groves who's been dropped in fights, been hurt in fights on numerous occasions now, and is slightly more risk averse. But I thought first 3 rounds he was very much straight 1-2. He was jabbing to the body nicely. It's one thing I did notice in this performance. His body work was good, and he would throw power shots to the body as well. And it may have even been a body power shot that finished the fight. So that was good. But I felt in the 4th and 5th round he started increasing his punch variety once he realised De Luisa had nothing to bother him. You started seeing him throwing a hook. You started seeing doubling up to the body a bit more, throwing left, right to the body. And as soon as Groves was able to come forward and put a bit more front foot pressure on his shots, he was able to get De Luisa out of there. The first couple of rounds he was more boxing with him, tapping with him, and trying to counterpunch when the gap came. Whereas in the 4th and 5th round, I felt he tried to come forward more and be a bit more front foot heavy and actually force the pace. And as soon as he was able to do that, he was able to get De Luisa out of there. If you watch this fight, you wouldn't necessarily look at it and think, oh, James DeGale is quaking in his boots, or something of that nature. The opponent was very, very average, and George Groves did what he needed to do. But you can't say it was a bad performance. He took very little back. Defensively, he was tight enough as George Groves goes. The jab was there. He was a bit light on his feet, and I thought it was a measured, decent performance from George Groves. Certainly, obviously, we need to see him against a higher calibre of opponent. I mean, this guy was well below a Christopher Abrace or a Paul Smith, even, for example. This guy was lower than George Groves has fought for quite some time, actually. So obviously we need to see him against a better level of opponent. Who knows whether it's going to be Martin Murray? Who knows whether it's going to be Callum Smith? There's lots of talk of those matchups later on in the year, so perhaps we'll see those. Will be interesting to find out. The undercard, it wasn't a bad night of boxing in the end. Let's start with John Ryder versus Comiskey. Credit to John Ryder for getting the win. I was dubious that he would get the win. I think the judges had it about right. I thought 116, 112 was a fair representation of this fight. And I have to give John Ryder a bit of credit, because Comiskey isn't a terrible opponent. He gave Blackwell, Martin Murray, Adam Etches, Frank Buglioni, he gave those 4 absolute hell. And those are some fighters who I would rate higher than John Ryder. But John Ryder was the only one who actually went out and definitely beat him, When we came to the finishing bell tonight, there wasn't any doubt in my mind, that John Ryder had won. I thought John Ryder was fairly scrappy at times in this fight. He was very defensively open, no head movement, and he's a fighter who really smothers his work. He's not a clean puncher, he's not a crisp puncher. And the Sky commentators, who I thought had a poor night in general, special mention for those guys, I thought got this one particularly wrong. They kept saying, Ryder should use his range, Ryder should use his boxing skills. But for me, Ryder didn't really have any range. Comiskey looked to be a far, far bigger man in there. And actually, when they were fighting from range, Comiskey seemed to be the more successful fighter. I mean, even though I think Ryder did win the fight, for my money, Comiskey was landing the more eye-catching shots from range. He seemed to be the power puncher in there. And when he was getting through with the long-range work, I, at times, thought Ryder could be in trouble in this fight. There were multiple points in this fight I was fairly confident Comiskey would win. But Ryder toughed it out. He showed that he didn't have a bad chin. He went the distance with a guy who knocked out Etches and Buglioni, etc. And on the whole, he did outwork the 41-year-old Comiskey. I think it was a solid enough performance in that sense. But I don't think the Sky commentators, I think they've dramatically got John Ryder wrong. John Ryder's a kind of small guy who kind of fights up close and hooks. He's not this long-range technician and chess player that they seem to think he is. And for me, Ryder is, whilst he's proven he's an adequate fighter taking out Comiskey, he's got deficiencies in his game. He's just not a crisp, eye-catching puncher. He doesn't have power. He doesn't put combinations together overly well. And I can't see him really being a force at world level. I can't really. He's very defensively open, no head movement, quite predictable and just quite scrappy. Not an overly classy performer. Certainly if you look at the distant difference between George Groves tonight and John Ryder, if you just look at the way they put punches together, the snap in their work, the difference seems to be vast for me. But credit to John Ryder, he showed chin, he showed stamina, and on the whole he outworked Comiskey. So yeah, credit to him goes for that. But whilst it probably is a career high win for him, you wouldn't necessarily think he's going to step up in class and keep winning. This may be the pinnacle for him. We'll see. It's a live division out there, so I'd like to see John Ryder in these 50-50 domestic matchups. For me, they're more entertaining than seeing him in 8-10 rounders on undercards, getting in sort of messy, scrappy fights. Finally, let's talk John Wayne Hibbert versus Tommy Martin, which was definitely fight of the night for me. We'll come to the stoppage in a bit, but for me this was, in hindsight, and hindsight is a wonderful thing, we see things very differently with hindsight. For me this was very poor matchmaking in hindsight for Tommy Martin. Tommy Martin was a 21-year-old boy with 13 pro fights. He performed at a decent level, but this was a massive, massive step up in class from Ricky Boylan. And it was man against boy in there. I mean, this fight was made at 140. Somebody tweeted me and said that Martin weighed in at 137 and he looked like a lightweight in there. He really looked like a lightweight. John Wayne Hibbert looked so much stronger, so much more physically capable. And as I say, man against boy is how to sum this up. There was a weight class between them. For me, Tommy Martin, age 21, he could have done with fighting at lightweight, not light welterweight. He could have done with another 2 or 3 learning fights. There was no need to rush him to this fight at this stage. And I felt he took a bit of a pasting in there. It was a very immature performance from Tommy Martin. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I just mean that in a factual way. He came out flailing, winging in shots wildly, slapping left, right. Very, very inaccurate. So much dancing. He's a good mover. He's got a good set of legs, but so much dancing and wheeling around in there that the energy was just being wasted left, right and centre. At the end of every round, he was doing this ridiculous sort of fist pump air, sign of the cross, fist pump air, looked like some sort of dance routine in there. And I kind of wanted his corner to slap him and say, look, you're 5 rounds down here, you're getting beaten from pillar to post. stop doing some sort of S Club 7 routine at the end of every round. You know, that's not the thing to be doing when your stamina's being sapped in a 12-round war. You know, I just felt it was an immature performance from him. At the end of round one, he went in to hug his opponent, and he spent a good 3-4 seconds putting a hug on his opponent. You know, this is a 12-round boxing fight. You know, I'm all for respect, I'm all for sportsmanship, but what I'm not for is hugging in the ring. You know, you've got 1 minute to recuperate between rounds and work out how you're going to take your opponent's head off in the next round. I don't mean to be blunt about it, but that's what the sport is about. And he's standing there doing a dance routine and hugging his opponent and then bouncing up and down like a rabbit and throwing in wild punches. You know, in 2 or 3 years' time, a bit more mature, a bit more learning fights, he could have won this fight. But immaturity lost it for him today. It really did. You know, he was too much movement and then burning out energy and having to recuperate on the ropes with his back to the ropes, and a much older, stronger, more experienced man piling in on him on the ropes and landing power punches. You know, halfway through this fight, 6 rounds in, I had Tommy Martin 5-1 down. You know, we had a decent spell in the mid rounds. At some point, I think after 8, I had it 5-3. But from there onwards, everything was John Wayne Hibbert. And I think even if the knockout hadn't come in the 12th, I'd have scored this fight 9-3 to John Wayne Hibbert. He was just a much harder puncher, pushing his opponent back. And the fight was basically lost because Hibbert was able to force Martin onto the ropes and was just unable to load power punches onto him to the ropes over and over again. And for me, Tommy Martin was too much style, not enough end product. You know, he can be a very good fighter in 3 or 4 years' time. He's got great heart, great movement, good punch variety. He picks punches very nicely, real classy boxer. But at this point, he's not a light welterweight, and at this point, he needs more education before these kind of matchups. You know, they need to step him back and give him some education, I think, because it was a fight that you could see him winning if he'd had 2 or 3 more learning fights. Credit to John Wayne Hibbert. You know, I was worried he was going to have a stamina problem in the middle of this fight, which I've often associated with Wayne Hibbert, but he came on strong towards the end and scored the stoppage, hurt Tommy Martin in the 12th round, and Tommy Martin misjudged the count. Now, I still think it was a bit of a howler here from the, from the referee. For me, Tommy Martin gets up at 9. Yeah, I know it's always risky getting up at 9, but it's called a 10 count for a reason, because you have 10 seconds to respond to the count. And Tommy Martin got up and responded to the count on 9. Yeah, it always puts you in dangerous territory, but you don't count someone out on 9. It's 9, 10, you're out. Yeah, Martin was up at 9. He shouldn't have been stopped. It was a poor stoppage. Regardless, I had it 9 rounds to 3. With the knockdown, I probably had Wayne Hibbert 7 rounds clear at the end. So it's kind of a moot point. You know, all in all, actually turned out not to be the worst bill this. You know, Wayne Hibbert versus Tommy Martin was a good fight. John Ryder versus Comiskey. I mean, it wasn't a great fight, but yeah, it was tight in places. And obviously the return of George Groves. Let me know your thoughts on these matchups. How do you think Groves looked? How do you think Ryder looked? What are your thoughts on the Tommy Martin fight versus John Wayne Hibbert? Where do you see the guys going from here? Who would you like George Groves to fight next? Many thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. Have a good evening, everyone.